Hello, my name is Alex Proctor. I'm the Chief Trust and Privacy Officer at Captain Compliance. This video is focused on the topic of data subject rights, or perhaps more specifically, the practical aspects of responding to data subject requests, or DSRs. This is a critical aspect of privacy operations, and it's extremely important to get right as privacy laws are implemented around the world. It's probably fairly obvious that handling data subject requests poorly can lead to serious compliance risk. We'll certainly address that in the video. What may not be as obvious is just how much time and energy can be lost by not having a thoughtful and efficient approach to handling DSRs. This will be a big part of the discussion as well, because in some ways it's an even greater challenge. In the first part of the video, I'll explain what data subject rights are and what it means to respect those rights around the world. I'll give a couple specific examples of privacy laws and how they enable individuals to make data subject rights requests that organizations must honor. We'll observe some compliance factors that are similar and also some that are different between the laws. Then we'll turn our attention to the practical aspects of managing a data subject request management program. We will examine some common challenges and also look at some ways that we can take them on to build the most efficient programs possible. Before I get any farther, I'd like to share a couple of quick disclaimers. First, like so many privacy topics, this one has legal implications. Decision-making about your DSR program should absolutely involve your legal team. Second, I represent Captain Compliance. We're a privacy technology company, and one of our offerings is an automated DSR portal. I'm not going to be focusing on our technology here, but do know that we'd be happy to help if your organization would benefit from a structured and automated approach to DSRs. I'll share contact information and other details in the video description. Okay, I've covered my bases. Let's get into it. Before we get to the topic of data subject requests, let's first orient ourselves around the topic of data subject rights. Individual privacy rights have a very long and rich history. You can look back for decades, and actually even further back, and see how ideas about privacy rights have evolved, especially alongside advancements in technology. I'll be focused on the modern era here. It's what's relevant to DSAR management today. But just know, this has been a very important subject for a very long time. I believe that the clearest way to introduce the concept of modern data subject rights is to quickly examine a couple of modern privacy laws. Let's first look to the European Union. If you're not familiar, the GDPR is currently the world's most influential privacy law. At the very core of the GDPR is the fact that it establishes several fundamental data subject rights. These rights include a right to information, right to access, right to rectification, right to erasure, right to restriction of processing, right to data portability, right to object, and right to not be subject to automated decision-making. Each of these 8 subject rights could be fully explored in their own videos, and I'm not going to do them all justice here. We'll talk about some of the specific rights a little bit later on. I do want to give one more example here, so let's look at California's comprehensive privacy law, the CPRA. Much like the GDPR, the CPRA also establishes several major data subject rights. These include the right to limit the use and disclosure of sensitive personal information, right to opt out of sale or sharing, right to correct, right to know, right to equal treatment, and right to delete. I think you get the picture. The EU and California both extend a collection of individual privacy rights to their constituents. It's the exact same theme with many other modern privacy laws, including both national laws and US state laws. The consumer rights aren't always the exact same from one region to the next, but they do tend to be similar. Now, let's shift our focus slightly. Along with establishing data subject rights, modern privacy laws enable individuals to make requests to organizations in order to exercise those fundamental rights. These requests are generally called data subject requests, or DSRs. By the way, before we step further into the topic, I just want to point out that this is another privacy domain that suffers from the overuse of acronyms. You've already heard the term DSR today. You will also hear the term DSAR, DSAR, which stands for Data Subject Access Request. If we're being technical, an access request is only one of multiple different categories of requests that a data subject might make. I'm pointing this out because you'll often observe these acronyms used interchangeably, and they also sound extremely similar when you hear them out loud. It's not a big deal, just know they technically refer to slightly different things. Now I want to take a few minutes to break down what's generally legally required of organizations when it comes to data subject requests. From that legal perspective, the main requirement is that organizations fulfill requests and that they do so within specific timeframes. These timeframes tend to be in the neighborhood of 30 to 45 days, but there are regions and laws which allow for even less time. In some cases, the laws require different response times for different types of requests, and also, in many jurisdictions, there are circumstances which allow for extensions. I won't have time to break down many of the privacy laws, but I will give a pair of contextualized examples. We'll start with the EU. Let's imagine that a data subject in the European Union wants to exercise their right to access, and they submit a formal DSR to an organization. As soon as that request is received, a clock starts running. Under the GDPR, the organization has to respond without undue delay no later than 1 month after receiving that request. Now, there are a few factors that can extend the timeline in the favor of the organization. If the request is particularly complex, or perhaps it involves a high volume of requests at once, that 1 month timeframe can be extended by up to 2 additional months. The timer can also be temporarily paused if the organization needs to request information from the data subject to confirm their identity. In any case, the organization is legally obligated to respond to the request against the backdrop of a running clock. Failure to meet this requirement may result in GDPR fines. Those GDPR fines can be very high, up to 20 million euros or 4% of total global turnover for severe violations. Now, let's consider a scenario in California where a data subject wants to exercise their right to correction. Like the GDPR, the CPRA's clock starts when the request is received. In this case, the organization has 45 days to process the request. That's a little bit longer than the GDPR allowed. However, the organization also has an obligation to respond back to the data subject within the first 10 days to confirm receipt of the request and to share information about how it will be processed. Like the GDPR, the CPRA allows for circumstantial extensions. If necessary, the organization can notify the data subject and convey their reasons justifying an additional 45-day extension. Unlike the GDPR, the law doesn't provide any mechanism to pause the clock while the identity of the data subject is being verified. Failing to comply with California's CPRA requirements can lead to fines as high as $7,500 for each intentional violation. One more interesting note on the CPRA. This is an example of a law that prescribes different timeline requirements for different rights. The right to know, the right to correct, and the right to delete all align to those requirements I just described. However, the right to opt out of sale or sharing and the right to limit the use and disclosure of sensitive personal information have much shorter timeline requirements. In these cases, requests must be processed within only 15 days from the date of receipt. No extensions are available here. Okay, I know we went deep there. I thought it was important because the laws all differ and they can have a lot of nuance to them. I hope that was a sufficient explanation of the type of compliance obligations that can be associated with data subject requests in different regions. Now, I want to spend a bit of time considering the different challenges that companies face when it comes to responding to data subject requests. For each challenge that I bring up, I'll also do my best to talk about a few things that organizations can do to mature their programs and minimize the impact of responding to requests. These challenges won't be ranked in any sort of prioritized way. I'm just going to try to present them in roughly the order that they might arise in a hypothetical DSR workflow. The first challenging aspect of DSR processing is often the intake process. Generally, the minimum bar here is that organizations need to provide a designated method, or depending on the jurisdiction and type of request, multiple methods for customers to exercise their privacy rights. Some laws, such as California's CPRA, get quite detailed, outlining specific circumstances when toll-free numbers should be used as opposed to email addresses, and so on. What I often see in the real world is organizations using what I'll call generic channels for DSR intake. For example, an organization's privacy notice might have a privacy rights section that directs consumers to a multi-purpose contact us type email address. This may technically satisfy the laws, but I'll suggest that it's not the best practice and it can lead to several problems. First, relying on generic channels makes it difficult to track, prioritize, and manage requests. If a dedicated inbox or more advanced DSR intake mechanism isn't in place, consumer requests can get lost amongst the likes of general inquiries, complaints, or support tickets. This lack of structure elevates the risk of delayed or even missed responses, which can obviously lead to non-compliance with privacy laws and those very specific response time requirements. It can also make it harder to track and audit requests in order to demonstrate compliance. Finally, there can be privacy and confidentiality issues here as well, as sensitive information may be handled by general customer support teams that aren't specifically trained or adequately familiarized with data privacy compliance. Another common challenge is that generic channels often fail to enable the level of process structure necessary for efficient DSR processing. The reality is, it can take a fair amount of contextual information from the data subject for an organization to be able to properly execute a privacy rights request. Organizations often need specific information to validate the identity of the requester, define the scope of the request, and so on. Simply relying on a generic email address can invite incomplete or otherwise poorly formed requests. Some of the time, this can lead to back and forth communications with the data subject that prolong the entire DSR process and frustrate all parties involved. There's one more thing that I should probably mention here, and that is the challenge of managing third-party or proxy requests. This can be a significant challenge in its own right. When a family member, legal representative, or data privacy rights service files a request on behalf of a data subject, organizations need to have a way to confirm the relationship and authority of that third party. Without a thoughtfully structured DSR intake process, it's easy to overlook necessary validation steps, which can potentially lead to unauthorized disclosures or similar problems. So, all of this begs the question, how can organizations improve DSR intake? Well, my first take is that a dedicated channel is almost always going to be better than a generic one. In practice, this could be as simple as having a dedicated privacy rights email address or phone number that's monitored by an appropriate individual or team. This solves a couple of the challenges I mentioned, but not all of them. A more complete solution than this might be to create a structured workflow for data subjects to submit their requests. This might be accomplished using a dedicated DSR web portal. The benefit here is that the organization can guide the data subject to provide the specific information that's needed and to validate the quality of the responses right at the time of the request. In addition to reducing the need to go back and forth with the data subject, this level of structure better supports notifications, identity and third-party verification, automated request fulfillment, auditing, and many other important aspects of the DSR process. Now that we've solved some DSR intake challenges, let's move on to another challenging aspect of DSR management. I want to spend a little bit of time here on DSR processing and fulfillment. Not to make light of the intake challenges I reviewed previously, but this is where we're going to be facing what I believe are the most difficult aspects of running an effective and efficient DSR program. Keep in mind as we work through this section, the ideal DSR processing model is going to look a little bit different for every organization. Some consumer-focused businesses and data brokers receive extremely high volumes of DSRs. Think hundreds of requests annually or maybe even more. On the flip side, there are also companies, usually in the business-to-business realm, that rarely receive DSR requests at all. Now, that doesn't necessarily make DSR processing any less of a challenge for the lower volume organizations, because when they do receive data subject requests, potentially from ex-employees or the like, they're likely to be heavier lifts. One of the root challenges that many organizations encounter has to do with a fundamental lack of visibility into their inventory of personal data, as well as a lack of contextual understanding about how it's being used. Frankly, this can be one of the core challenges to all aspects of privacy, beyond just DSR management. Within the DSR context, this lack of visibility can rear its head in quite an ugly way. If a data subject submits a request, say to access their personal data or to restrict the processing of that data, and you don't know exactly what it is, where it is, and how it's being used, that spells trouble. At best, your team will spend excessive energy attempting to fulfill the DSR request. At worst, it might be fulfilled inadequately or not at all. Your team may think that they've addressed the request and even communicate that to the data subject without actually having done so. Again, that's bad news all around. The solution here is simple in theory and yet not always so simple in practice. It's very important to maintain accurate and useful inventories of personal data stores, as well as the types of personal data that they're being used to maintain and how that data is being used. This is why the GDPR and other privacy laws require organizations to maintain ROPAs, records of processing activities. For some organizations, particularly those that might be smaller or more limited in their personal data processing, it can be reasonable to create and update these records manually. For larger organizations, particularly those with more complex personal data processing, it's often beneficial to introduce some form of dynamic and automated personal data discovery, at the very least to supplement manual efforts. There are all kinds of places where personal data can be stored or processed, and it's not always in the most obvious places. This is especially true when it comes to cloud-based applications, which can sometimes fly under the radar. For the sake of time, I'm going to move on. Just know that maintaining a personal data inventory and having a contextual understanding of how it's processed is absolutely fundamental to DSR processing. The next challenge I want to touch on has to do with DSR workflow planning. Much like it's important to have a documented data inventory, it's also very important to have documented processes for responding to various categories of DSR requests. These DSR requests can take up significant time, even when executed well, and with limited resources, it's really important to be able to address them in a way that doesn't waste unnecessary time and energy. The other important aspect of this sort of planning is that it helps make sure that requests are correctly executed in a way that respects the privacy rights of the data subject. I've found that many organizations struggle with this sort of DSR workflow planning, and it can be for a variety of reasons. Maybe the inventory-related building blocks are lacking, maybe systems integrations are complex, or maybe the rate of change in technology and business process is just hard to keep up with over time. In any case, as a first step, just getting basic DSR workflows documented is a good start. It's an ideal opportunity to get specific and figure out which individuals or roles need to be involved in different types of requests, as well as thinking about how different systems and data flows are relevant. While it might make sense to start with creating workflows for the categories of requests that are most frequently seen, it's also important to remember that the documentation might actually provide the most value when it comes time to execute on that rarely seen category of request. It's probably a good idea to create workflows for each category of request that might come through, and potentially for different technology environments. Once DSR workflows are developed and well understood, a more direct way to enable efficiency is through the use of automation. This is a time when it makes sense to focus on the categories of requests that your organization receives most frequently. For example, if you receive a large volume of requests for erasure from your customers, it may be worth building or investing in tools that automate portions of the erasure process. For example, you might imagine having your DSR portal integrate with the API of your customer database in order to fulfill those requests in an automated way that minimizes manual effort. Whether you take it to this level or not, the key is to streamline the high-volume, repetitive tasks that might have a tendency to bog down your DSR team. This isn't to say that it makes sense to automate everything. Humans should have oversight over all DSR processing, and there's also some types of requests that are just better addressed manually. Okay, we've talked about some DSR intake challenges and DSR fulfillment challenges. I have a couple more that I'd like to discuss, and I'll categorize them as DSR compliance challenges. One DSR compliance challenge has to do with redaction. When fulfilling a data subject request, especially access requests, or any other request that involves sharing information back to the requester, it's generally ideal to provide only the personal data relevant to that individual and nothing more. Over-disclosing information can expose sensitive data, leading to potential privacy violations, and even put the organization at risk of regulatory scrutiny. Imagine sending a customer a copy of their data that inadvertently includes unrelated sensitive information, such as the personal data of another person. This clearly presents a significant privacy risk. This challenge is amplified in situations where personal data can be interpreted broadly. In some circumstances, organizations may be required to provide copies of any documents, emails, or records that mention the data subject by name or in another identifiable way. For instance, if the data subject's name appears in internal email chains, meeting notes, or collaborative project files, at least some of that information may need to be disclosed as part of an access request. The complexity here is twofold. First, it requires a high degree of diligence to locate all of the instances where the data subject's personal data appears across various systems and document types, both structured and unstructured. And second, it necessitates a careful review to ensure that there's no extraneous data, like information about third parties, inadvertently included. This is why redaction protocols and workflows are essential for these situations, to enable you to extract only the necessary data while securely omitting anything that falls outside the scope of the request. In many cases, redaction is not just about removing names and simple details. Depending on the context of the in-scope material, entire sections or paragraphs may need to be redacted to prevent over-disclosure back to the data subject. This makes fulfilling DSRs particularly challenging, as it's essential to balance the subject's right to access with the privacy rights of others and the need to protect confidential information. Another DSR compliance challenge has to do with the fact that the requirements differ between regions. I talked earlier about how privacy laws vary from one another, and those differences may require nuance in how organizations choose to handle DSRs. Some organizations choose to respect a broad set of subject rights somewhat universally, while others align their practices more directly with specific regional laws. That universal approach involves creating a single streamlined process that aims to meet the strictest relevant legal requirements. Doing this can simplify operations and help ensure a high level of consistency, as well as reduce the risk of accidental noncompliance due to procedure inconsistency. It's also generally favorable for building trust and goodwill with customers if you're respecting their privacy rights in regions where it's not legally mandated. The downside of the approach is that it can lead to unnecessary operational impact in regions with less stringent requirements, potentially overextending resources. On the other hand, a regional approach tailors DSR practices to meet specific local regulations, accommodating the different nuances in each jurisdiction. For example, as we discussed previously, some regions have different deadlines for response times. This tailored approach allows organizations to be a bit more agile and resource efficient by aligning to those minimum requirements in each specific region. However, managing multiple different regional processes can also increase operational complexity and may lead to inconsistencies if not managed well. There really isn't any right or wrong approach here. It's just something to be thoughtful about. The last topic I'll mention here is record keeping. This plays a crucial role in demonstrating DSR compliance. This can include keeping track of details like the date that requests are received, how they're verified, the actions taken in response, and any communications with the data subject. Proper record keeping not only supports regulatory obligations, but also serves as a valuable tool for internal audits, identifying trends and requests, and illuminating any potential weaknesses in the DSR process. When it comes to solutions for all of these compliance-related challenges, it really just comes down to maintaining a process-oriented, efficient DSR program. This can help transform DSR fulfillment from a reactive obligation that can strain resources into a more proactive, trust-building asset. Okay, we've reached the end of the video. I hope that you found the information helpful. As I mentioned previously, I represent Captain Compliance. Our DSR portal is an excellent tool for automating the intake and end-to-end processing of data subject requests. If you need help, please feel free to visit our website. It's captaincompliance.com. I'll put the link as well as additional contact information in the video description. Thanks again for watching, and I wish you success with your DSR program.